In the spring of 1907, an 18-year-old young man arrived in Vienna with a portfolio of watercolors under his arm and the certainty that the Academy of Fine Arts would accept him. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the border with Bavaria, the son of Alois Hitler, a customs official of rigid and authoritarian character, and Clara Pölzl, whom Adolf adored with an intensity that later psychologists described as the only genuinely deep emotional bond of his life. Clara died of breast cancer on December 21, 1907, just a few months after Adolf arrived in Vienna. The doctor who treated her in her last weeks, Eduard Bloch, was Jewish. Bloch recalled in his memoirs, written decades later in American exile, that Hitler always treated him with gratitude and respect. In 1938, after the Anschluss, Bloch received unusual protection from the Gestapo that allowed him to emigrate safely. Those who have tried to explain Hitler's antisemitism as a consequence of that medical relationship are confronted with this uncomfortable detail. The first rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts came in October 1907. The admissions jury examined Hitler's drawings and issued its verdict. The candidate lacked sufficient talent for painting, although his architectural works showed some aptitude. They recommended that he consider studying architecture. Hitler did not have the high school diploma required to enroll in the School of Architecture. He reapplied to the Academy in 1908. This time he did not even reach the examination phase. The jury discarded his portfolio in the preliminary selection. These two rejections have been analyzed by historians and psychologists for decades as possible factors in the development of his resentment. Ian Kershaw, in his biography Hitler, 1889–1936 Hubris, concludes that the connection is real but insufficient as an explanation. Hitler's antisemitism had ideological roots that went beyond any personal frustration. After the second rejection, Hitler disappeared from the social life he had previously led. He did not return to Linz, where his family expected him. He stayed in Vienna. At first he lived off his paternal inheritance savings and a monthly orphan's pension. When those resources ran out, he moved to men's hostels in the Meidling district in the south of the city, where for 50 heller a day, less than the price of a coffee, he got a bed in a shared dormitory with other men without means. It was a life on the edge between misery and survival. There he sold postcards painted with Viennese buildings to tourists and merchants, using a hostel companion named Reinhold Hannisch as a commercial intermediary. The relationship ended badly. Hitler accused Hannisch of keeping part of the income, reported him to the police, and had him briefly arrested. It was 1910. Hitler was 21 years old and living in poverty, but he was already showing a tendency to see conspiracies and betrayals in any personal setback. Vienna at that time was a city that defied any simple description. With 2 million inhabitants, it was the 5th most populous city in Europe and the capital of an empire that governed 16 languages and dozens of ethnic groups. It was the home of Sigmund Freud, who published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 from his practice at Bergasse 19. It was the home of Ludwig Wittgenstein, Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, and Arnold Schoenberg, whose 12-tone music scandalized the conservative audiences of the central cafes. It was also home to a decaying middle class, threatened by industrialization, mass migration from the Eastern Empire, and the rise of new elites. This middle class, which had lost economic certainties but retained a cultural identity it considered superior to that of recent immigrants, was the perfect breeding ground for anti-Semitic populism. In 1907, Vienna had a Jewish community of approximately 175,000 people, 8.6% of the city's total population. This community was extraordinarily visible in the intellectual, commercial, and professional life of the capital. Viennese Jews were disproportionately represented in medicine, law, journalism, banking, and the arts. About 60% of the city's doctors were Jewish. Around 50% of the lawyers were Jewish. In the press, newspapers such as the Neue Freie Presse, Austria's most influential daily, were mainly directed and written by Jewish journalists. For a young failed artist who saw in every successful Jew proof of unfair competition, that visibility was irritating. For the developing anti-Semite, it was confirmation. Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna since 1897, was the first politician Hitler observed closely and openly admired. Lueger had built his political career on a mixture of urban populism, social Catholicism, and instrumental antisemitism. He was brilliant and charismatic. He had modernized Vienna's infrastructure, municipalizing gas, electricity, and trams, and at the same time delivered speeches describing Jews as parasites of the Viennese economy. What was notable about Lueger, which Hitler observed carefully, was that his antisemitism was selective and pragmatic. When a critic pointed out that he associated with Jewish people, he replied with a phrase that became famous, "I decide who is a Jew." For Hitler, this phrase embodied a fundamental political lesson. Antisemitism was a tool, and its application could be adjusted according to convenience. Lueger died in March 1910. Hitler attended his funeral among the crowd. Georg Ritter von Schönerer, 1842 to 1921, was the second major political influence Vienna provided Hitler. Schönerer was a member of the Austrian parliament and leader of the radical pan-German movement, which demanded the incorporation of the German-speaking territories of Austria-Hungary into the German Empire. Unlike Lueger, whose antisemitism was strategic and combined with Catholicism, Schönerer was a pure racial antisemite who also attacked the Catholic Church for its supranational character and its ties to Rome, which he considered incompatible with German nationalism. Schönerer had been sentenced in 1888 to 4 months in prison for storming the offices of the liberal Neues Wiener Tagblatt with his followers and assaulting employees because the newspaper had published news of Kaiser Wilhelm I's death before it was officially announced. He lost his noble title and political rights for 5 years. For his followers, he was a martyr. For Hitler, he was a figure who demonstrated that radicalism without political calculation leads to failure, a lesson he internalized and would later apply differently. What Vienna provided Hitler was not only political ideas, it provided him with a visual vocabulary of antisemitism that he absorbed from the city's popular culture. Kiosk magazines of a Völkisch orientation, especially Ostara, published by the exclostrated monk Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels from 1905, combined occultism, Germanic paganism, and racism in a popular format with illustrations. Ostara developed fantasies about Aryan racial superiority, described Jews and other races as humanoid beasts threatening the purity of the Nordic man, and included pseudo-scientific remedies to strengthen the Aryan race through reproductive selection. Hitler claimed in Mein Kampf that he read Ostara regularly in Vienna and personally sought out Lanz von Liebenfels to request back issues of the magazine. Historians have verified that the visit did indeed occur, possibly in 1909 or 1910. Lanz von Liebenfels recalled in his memoirs that Hitler arrived at his office as a thin, poorly dressed young man who spoke with intensity disproportionate to his appearance. The protocols of the Elders of Zion circulated in Vienna during this period in Austrian and German editions. There is no direct evidence that Hitler read them during his Viennese years, although the document's content, the theory of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy simultaneously controlling capitalism and communism, precisely matches the arguments Hitler would develop in his early political speeches in 1919 and 1920. It is reasonable to assume that he absorbed this content indirectly through pamphlets, articles, and conversations that made up the anti-Semitic ecosystem of Vienna at the time. In Mein Kampf, Hitler described his transformation into an anti-Semite as the result of a slow, almost scientific process of observation and reasoning. He recounted the supposed moment of revelation. He saw a man in a dark coat with curls in the center of Vienna and wondered whether that being was German. He studied his physiognomy, he bought anti-Semitic books, he compared these readings with his daily observations, and he came, according to his account, to the logical conclusion that Jews were the cause of all the evils he saw in the city. Historians, led by Brigitte Hamann in her exhaustive study Hitler's Wien, 1996, have dismantled this narrative with detailed documentation. Hamann demonstrated that several of Hitler's companions in the Meidling hostel were Jewish, that Hitler maintained fluid and tension-free commercial relationships with Jewish art merchants, and that there is no contemporary evidence that he expressed militant antisemitism during his Viennese years. Hamann's conclusion, shared by Kershaw, is that the Mein Kampf narrative was constructed retrospectively to provide ideological coherence to a more gradual and less dramatic evolution. Hitler's antisemitism during the Viennese years was likely diffuse, absorbed from the environment, not yet the closed and obsessive system he developed after World War I. In May 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich. The official reason was his desire to live on German soil. The practical reason, documented in Austrian archives, was that he was trying to avoid mandatory military service in the Austro-Hungarian army, for which he was of conscription age. Austrian authorities located him in Munich and summoned him for a medical examination in Salzburg in February 1914. He was classified as unfit for combat or auxiliary service due to physical weakness. 4 months later, the war that would define his life began. Germany before Hitler, the soil that was already poisoned. In 1871, when Otto von Bismarck unified the German states under the crown of Kaiser Wilhelm I, the German Empire was born with a fundamental contradiction within it. The legal emancipation of German Jews had been proclaimed that same year. For the first time in the history of the territory, Jews were equal citizens under the law, with the right to vote, to practice professions, and to hold public office. That emancipation was real on paper. In practice, it came accompanied by a reaction of resentment that grew in proportion to the speed with which German Jews took advantage of the new opportunities. The process of integration was extraordinarily rapid. In the 1870s and 1880s, German Jews, who constituted only 1.2% of the empire's total population, were represented far beyond their demographic weight in medicine, law, banking, wholesale trade, and journalism. In Berlin, the capital of the empire, by the end of the 19th century, approximately 12% of doctors and 25% of lawyers were Jewish. The department stores that transformed German urban commerce, Wertheim, Tietz, Kadewa, were founded and run by Jewish families. This visibility was interpreted by sectors of the German bourgeoisie not as the natural result of legal emancipation, but as evidence of a suspicious capacity for penetration. Jewish success, instead of refuting anti-Semitic stereotypes, fed them with new apparent evidence. The 1873 stock market crash, known in Germany as the Gründerkrach, the founders' collapse, was the trigger for the first major wave of modern political antisemitism in the empire. The uncontrolled speculation that followed the euphoria of unification collapsed in May of that year, ruining thousands of small investors from the German middle class. Jewish bankers, who were visible in Berlin's financial circles, were disproportionately blamed relative to their actual participation in the speculation. Historian Werner Jochmann documented in his studies on German antisemitism of that period that the 1873 crisis created for the first time a political market for economic antisemitism among segments of the middle class that had previously been indifferent or relatively tolerant. Adolf Stürmer, court chaplain and highly influential Lutheran preacher, founded in 1878 the Christliche Soziale Partei, Christian Social Party, the first German political party to incorporate anti-Semitism as a central element of its program. Stürmer attacked Jews from the pulpit and the parliamentary rostrum with arguments that mixed the religious with the economic. Jews were responsible for liberalism, which destroyed traditional German communities, for financial capitalism, which exploited workers, and for Marxism, which threatened the Christian order. His party never reached a majority, but it placed the anti-Semitic discourse at the center of German political debate with a legitimacy that a corner monk or street pamphleteer could never have provided. Stürmer was received in the salons of the Prussian aristocracy, preached before Kaiser Wilhelm I himself, and was tolerated by Bismarck as a useful instrument to channel social discontent toward objectives that did not threaten the state. Heinrich von Treitschke was the second major vector of German academic antisemitism in this period. Treitschke was a professor of history at the University of Berlin, a member of the Reichstag, and probably the most influential German historian of his generation. In November 1879, he published in the Preußischen Jahrbüchern, the Prussian yearbooks, Germany's most prestigious academic journal, an article titled Unsere Aussichten, Our Prospects, in which he coined the phrase that would become the slogan of German antisemitism for decades: Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. Treitschke was not a tavern agitator. He was a respected intellectual writing in the register of rigorous historical analysis. This is exactly what made his intervention dangerous. It gave antisemitism the veneer of serious academic thought, made it citable in universities and respectable in bourgeois circles that would have scorned Stücker's demagoguery. Treitschke's phrase had a historical trajectory that its author did not anticipate. Decades later, Julius Streicher used it as a permanent epigraph on the pages of Der Stürmer. When Nuremberg prison guards searched Streicher's cell before his execution, they found a copy of Treitschke's articles among his possessions, underlined. The line from the Berlin professor of 1879 to the 1934 anti-Semitic newspaper is not metaphorical, it is documented. The response of the German Jewish community to Treitschke's anti-Semitic campaign was led by historian Theodor Mommsen, also a professor in Berlin and Nobel Prize in Literature winner in 1902. Mommsen published in 1880 a direct reply to Treitschke, defending the full integration of Jews into German society and denouncing antisemitism as an irrational social disease. The exchange between Treitschke and Mommsen in the pages of German academic journals was closely followed by the empire's entire intellectual elite. But history remembered Treitschke's phrase more than Mommsen's arguments. Hatred is more memorable than reason. In 1880, conservative politician Bernhard Förster, brother-in-law of Friedrich Nietzsche, who publicly repudiated his brother-in-law for his ideas, organized the first major anti-Semitic petition of the German Empire. The document, known as the Antisemitism petition, demanded the exclusion of Jews from public office, the restriction of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, and the exclusion of Jews from teaching. It gathered 265,000 signatures in less than 2 years and was submitted to Chancellor Bismarck, who ignored it. But the exercise demonstrated something the organizers knew. Antisemitism had a sufficient social base to become an electoral force. The Reichstag elections of 1887 and 1890 showed this force converted into votes for the first time. Several candidates who made antisemitism the center of their campaign won seats. In 1893, German anti-Semitic parties, Max Liebermann von Sonnenberg's Deutsch-Soziale Partei, Otto Böckel's Antisemitische Volkspartei, and other smaller groups, collectively won 16 seats in the Reichstag, with approximately 263,000 votes. It was a fraction of parliament, but a fraction elected on a platform of racial hatred in the parliament of continental Europe's most powerful state. Historian Richard S. Levy documented in The Downfall of the Anti-Semitic Political Parties in Imperial Germany, 1975, that these anti-Semitic parties collapsed electorally in the first decade of the 20th century, partly due to internal disputes and partly because their voters were absorbed by traditional conservative parties that adopted anti-Semitic rhetoric without making it their sole issue. The failure of these parties was interpreted by some contemporaries as evidence that political antisemitism had reached its ceiling. In retrospect, it was only a pause. The Dreyfus affair in France had an immediate echo in Germany. The judicial process, the street demonstrations in Paris, and the polarization it caused were closely followed by the German press. What German anti-Semites saw in the Dreyfus case was not the injustice of a false accusation, but confirmation that Jews could infiltrate the army and state of any nation, even France, the oldest democracy on continental Europe. German anti-Semitic newspapers, Deutsch Soziale Blätter, Staatsbürger Zeitung, Reichsbote, published analyses presenting the case as proof of hidden Jewish power. French anti-Semitism was a reassuring mirror for them. They were not the only ones seeing the danger. The mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe was the third major factor feeding German anti-Semitism in the pre-Hitler period. Between 1880 and 1914, Tsarist persecutions in the Russian Empire, pogroms following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, and the misery of the Pale of Settlement, the forced settlement zone where most Russian Jews lived, pushed between 2 and 3 million Jews to emigrate westward. Most aimed ultimately for the United States, but Germany was a country of transit and intermediate destination. Eastern Jews, the Ostjuden, were visually different from assimilated German Jews. They dressed traditionally, spoke Yiddish, and practiced orthodox forms of religiosity no longer recognized by Reform German Jews as their own. Their arrival was uncomfortable both for non-Jewish Germans and for middle-class German Jews, who feared that the visibility of the newcomers would exacerbate the antisemitism they themselves suffered. The figure of the Ostjude, the Eastern Jew, became the privileged target of German anti-Semitic propaganda. He was the authentic Jew, unassimilated, bearing all the traits that anti-Semitic stereotypes attributed to the race. World War I interrupted but did not eliminate this dynamic. The Judenzählung, the census of Jews in the army, ordered by the High Command in October 1916, already mentioned in the previous chapter, had a devastating effect on the morale of German Jewish soldiers fighting at the front. It was the first time the German army segregated its own soldiers by racial criteria to investigate whether they fulfilled their military obligations. The measure implicitly validated the anti-Semitic accusation that Jews avoided combat. When the results proved otherwise, they were classified and never published. The damage had already been done. What Hitler found when he arrived in Munich in 1913 and later when he began his political activity in 1919 was not a blank country to be convinced of anti-Semitism from scratch. He found a country where anti-Semitism had 40 years of organized political history, an academic tradition that gave it intellectual respectability, a press that regularly disseminated it, and a middle class that had absorbed it as part of the normal cultural landscape. His contribution was not to invent hatred. It was to turn it from background noise into a government program. The birth of the Nazi Party, Anti-Semitism as a political program. On September 12, 1919, Adolf Hitler attended a meeting of the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, German Workers' Party, for the first time in the back room of the Stürmer, a brewery in Munich's Old Town. He had arrived as an agent of the Agitation and Intelligence Department of the 4th Rifle Battalion of the Bavarian Reichswehr, sent to monitor far-right groups that had proliferated in the city since the crushing of the Bavarian Soviet Republic in May of that year. The party he found had fewer than 60 active members, met in back rooms of breweries, and had neither structure nor money. Anton Drexler, the party's founder, was a railway turner by trade, a working-class nationalist convinced that Marxism and capitalism were two sides of the same Jewish coin. Alongside him, Dietrich Eckart was the intellectually most developed figure in the initial circle, poet, playwright, editor of the anti-Semitic weekly Auf gut Deutsch, in good German, and a man with connections to the Munich bourgeoisie and aristocracy. Eckart had translated Ibsen's Peer Gynt into German, regularly smoked opium, and had long been convinced that a providential figure would transform Germany. When he met Hitler, he believed he had found that figure. Eckart was the one who brought Hitler into the salons of Bavarian high society, taught him how to dress and behave in those settings, and connected him with the financiers the party needed. In the first volume of Mein Kampf, Hitler dedicated the book to him with the words, "To the man who devoted his life to awakening the German people." What Hitler discovered in those first weeks was not just a party. He discovered that he had an exceptional talent for oratory. His first public speech was on October 16, 1919, at the Hofbräukeller in Munich before 111 people. He spoke for 30 minutes about the causes of Germany's defeat and Jewish responsibility. At the end, the hall applauded him. In his later notes, Hitler described that moment as a revelation. He knew he had found his vocation. Army reports on his propaganda activities already described Hitler at that time as a mass speaker of remarkable ability. On February 24, 1920, at the Hofbräuhaus in Munich, before nearly 2,000 people, Hitler presented the party's 25-point program, at which meeting the party took the name Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP. The meeting was tumultuous, organized groups were ready to disrupt, and the SA, the party's assault sections, still forming, responded with physical violence. Hitler spoke for more than 2 hours. The program he presented was explicit in its anti-Semitic objectives. Point 4 stated that no Jew could be a German citizen. Point 5 classified them as foreigners subject to foreigner legislation. Point 23 demanded that Jewish newspapers be banned or subjected to prior censorship. Point 24 defended religious freedom only for those who did not pose a threat to the Germanic spirit, a formula that transparently excluded Judaism. The meeting ended without serious incidents. Hitler left convinced that the mix of nationalist agitation, anti-Semitism, and promises of social redemption was a viable electoral formula. There is one aspect of the inner workings of the Nazi Party in its formative years that is rarely mentioned: the deliberate construction of a para-religious liturgy. The party meetings were not conventional political rallies. They were acts designed to produce intense collective emotional experiences. The banners, torches, uniforms, anthems, the ritual order of entrances and exits, the flags with the swastika, all were calculated to create a sense of sacred belonging that established churches no longer provided to many secularized but spiritually hungry Germans. Hitler had observed this dimension in Viennese politics and perfected it. The emotional architecture of the Nazi movement was inseparable from its ideological content. Alfred Rosenberg arrived in Munich from Tallinn in 1918, fleeing the Russian Revolution with the protocols of the Elders of Zion under his arm. Trained as an architect, with enough philosophical education to construct a more elaborate ideological system than Hitler's, he became the chief editor of the party's newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, People's Observer, purchased by the NSDAP in December 1920 with funds partially contributed by Dietrich Eckart and Gottfried Feder. In 1920, Rosenberg published one of the first annotated German editions of the Protocols, adding notes that connected the text to the events of the Bolshevik Revolution. For him, Lenin and Trotsky were the living proof of the conspiracy described in the Protocols. Hitler read these editions. The references to the Protocols in Mein Kampf closely follow Rosenberg's annotations. Julius Streicher, a primary school teacher in Nuremberg and a tavern anti-Semitic speaker, founded the weekly Der Stürmer in March 1923. From the beginning, the paper adopted a style unprecedented in the German political press: crude caricatures, accusations of sexual crimes, and blood libels updated to the 20th century. Streicher understood that to reach audiences with little formal education, one had to speak to instinct rather than reason. His caricatures portrayed Jews with deliberately repulsive physical features associated with rats, snakes, and parasites. The constant repetition of these images over the years built in regular readers a reflexive association between the word Jew and a visceral feeling of disgust. Later, social psychologists would call this classical conditioning applied to political propaganda. In 1923, Streicher merged into the NSDAP and from then on was one of Hitler's most loyal and unconditional followers. Hermann Göring, a World War I aviation ace with 22 confirmed aerial victories and recipient of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, joined the party in October 1922. Göring brought to the NSDAP something no other member had: real military respectability, connections with the Bavarian aristocracy, and the ability to obtain financing from industrial circles in southern Germany. His Swedish wife, Karin von Kantzau, opened the family mansion near Munich as a meeting place where Hitler was introduced to businessmen and politicians who would otherwise not have received him. Göring was also the one who formally organized and trained the SA, transforming them from brewery thugs into a paramilitary force with a command structure. The beer hall putsch and ideological consolidation. On the afternoon of November 8, 1923, the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich was full. Gustav von Kahr, State Commissioner of Bavaria, was giving a speech to approximately 3,000 attendees, including prominent figures from Bavarian politics and business. At 8:30 p.m., a group of armed men burst through the side doors. Adolf Hitler jumped onto a chair, fired a shot at the ceiling, and announced that the national revolution had begun. He held a pistol in his hand, and his face displayed a certainty that, according to witnesses present, was almost hypnotic. What followed in the subsequent hours revealed both Hitler's audacity and his real limitations. He managed to get von Kahr, General Otto von Lossow, and Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser, the three men with effective power in Bavaria, to verbally declare their support for the revolution in a back room under the direct threat of a pistol. He also succeeded in having Erich Ludendorff, Germany's most admired war hero, appear at the venue to provide moral support for the coup. But while Hitler managed the situation inside, von Kahr sent coded messages to the Munich garrison ordering resistance. When Hitler left the building to deal with a problem elsewhere in the city, Ludendorff, believing in the honor of the military, allowed von Kahr to leave. This was the fatal mistake of the evening. By dawn on November 9th, it was clear that the coup had failed politically. The Munich military garrison had not joined. The central government in Berlin had declared a state of emergency, but Hitler and Ludendorff decided to make one final gamble, to march toward the city centre, toward the Bavarian Ministry of Defence, relying on Ludendorff's presence to paralyze soldiers who might resist. The column, numbering between 2,000 and 3,000 people, advanced along Residenzstrasse toward the Feldherrnhalle, the memorial hall in front of which a detachment of about 100 Bavarian police were blocking the way. What happened in the next few seconds remains a subject of historical dispute. Both sides later claimed that the other fired first. What is certain is that in the brief firefight, 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler, who was marching arm in arm with the man next to him, dislocated his shoulder as he threw himself to the ground when the shooting began. According to some witnesses, the man beside him was hit, and Hitler fell dragged by the weight of the collapsing body. According to others, he threw himself down voluntarily. Göring was hit in the groin and evacuated to Austria, where his morphine addiction began during recovery. Ludendorff continued walking forward without ducking, crossed the police cordon, and was arrested without resistance. Hitler fled in a car and was arrested 2 days later at Ernst Hans Stengel's villa in Uffing am Staffelsee, south of Munich, hidden in a closet with his arm in a sling. The trial, held from February 26 to April 1, 1924, in the Munich Infantry School building, was Hitler's first national stage. The 3-judge panel, headed by Georg Neidhardt, an openly sympathetic supporter of the Völkisch movement, allowed Hitler to interrupt witnesses, deliver speeches over 2 hours long, and turn each session into a propaganda event. Hitler did not deny the facts, he claimed them. He declared that he was not a traitor, but that those who had preceded him in power were the true traitors of Germany. The courtroom applauded several times. Newspapers across the country reproduced his speeches. A man who 12 months earlier had been virtually unknown outside Bavaria was now a national political figure. The sentence was 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 months, the legal minimum for the charge of high treason. He entered the Landsberg am Lech fortress prison on April 11, 1924. There he received continuous visits, flowers, and gifts from admirers, and was treated by the prison staff with a deference that no ordinary prisoner would have received. He shared the space with Rudolf Hess, who had voluntarily surrendered to accompany his leader, and with 40 other convicts from the Putsch, whom Hitler received every morning in the garden as an informal court. In Landsberg, Hitler dictated the text that would become Mein Kampf. Hess transcribed, organized, and occasionally corrected the style. Emil Maurice, Hitler's chauffeur and personal guard, also participated in the initial transcriptions. The book was not originally conceived as an ideological work, but as a response to the accusations of the trial. The original title was 4,5 Jahre des Kampfes gegen Lüge, Dummheit und Feigheit, 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity and cowardice. Max Amann, director of the party's Eher Verlag publishing house, convinced Hitler that the title was too long and simplified it to Mein Kampf. Chapter 11 of the first volume, titled Nation and Race, is the ideological core of the book. In it, Hitler developed his vision of history as a permanent racial struggle, identified the Jew as the ultimate parasite of human history, and described Bolshevism as the final instrument of worldwide Jewish domination. The language is explicitly biologistic. Jews are compared to bacilli, parasites, germs. They are not citizens of an inferior category. They are pathological agents infecting the healthy national body. This medical metaphor is crucial because it shifts the discourse from the political to the health sphere. It is not about persecuting people, but about eliminating a disease. Extermination ceases to be a crime and becomes a public hygiene operation. Hitler was released on December 20, 1924, having served just over 8 months. The first volume of Mein Kampf was published on July 18, 1925. That year, 9,473 copies were sold. The second volume, published in December 1926, sold less. It was not until 1933, when Hitler came to power, that the book became a mass publishing phenomenon. Between 1933 and 1945, over 12 million copies were printed in German. The Eher Verlag, the party's publishing house, earned enough royalties to make Hitler a millionaire before he came to power. One aspect historians have emphasized is that Mein Kampf was not widely read during the Weimar years. Most Germans who voted for the NSDAP in 1932 had not read the book. What sold the party was not the written ideology, but the emotional experience of rallies, the promise of order and work, and Hitler's ability to make simple problems seem complex while always pointing to the same culprit. Mein Kampf mattered not because people read it, but because it existed. It was proof that the party had a doctrine, coherence, and seriousness that other right-wing parties lacked. The night of broken glass, when the state took off its mask. On November 7, 1938, at 9:35 a.m., Herschel Feibel Grynszpan entered the German embassy in Paris, on Rue de Lille, and asked to speak with a diplomat. He was 17 years old, born in Hanover, and had been living illegally in the city for weeks, staying at his uncle's house after fleeing Germany. What had brought him to that door was a postcard from his sister Berta, sent from the Polish border, describing the conditions in which thousands of Polish Jews residing in Germany had been deported. On the night of October 28th to 29th, the SS and the Gestapo had raided homes across Germany, arrested around 17,000 Polish nationals of Jewish descent, and transported them by train to the Polish border, where they were pushed on foot into Polish territory in rainy and cold conditions. Poland initially refused to accept them. They were stranded for days in the border town of Zbonszyn without sufficient food, inadequate shelter, sleeping in stables and makeshift barracks. The entire Grynszpan family was among them. Grynszpan was received by Ernst vom Rath, the third secretary of the embassy. He shot him 5 times. Vom Rath was hit twice and was taken to Georges Pompidou Hospital in critical condition. French authorities immediately arrested Grynszpan. When interrogated, he said, "Being a Jew is not a crime. I am not a dog. I have the right to live, and the Jewish people have the right to exist in this world." Vom Rath died on November 9th at 5:30 p.m. That day was the anniversary of the 1923 Munich Putsch, the most sacred date in the Nazi calendar. The news reached Hitler during the annual commemorative dinner at the Altes Rathaus in Munich, while party leaders were celebrating the 15th anniversary of the failed coup. Goebbels approached Hitler, whispered something, and Hitler left the table without delivering the speech expected of him. Goebbels spoke instead. In his diaries that night he noted, "I present the situation to the Führer. He decides. Let the demonstrations continue. Withdraw the police. The Jews must feel the fury of the people for once." The decision was not recorded in any formal written order. It was transmitted orally to the SS and SA leaders present in the room, who relayed it by telephone to their regional structures throughout Germany and Austria. What followed on the night of November 9th to 10th was not spontaneous. It was a coordinated operation, carried out with a speed only possible when a functional chain of command exists. The SA and SS received specific instructions. They could destroy Jewish property but not loot it for personal enrichment. They could attack people but were to avoid killing. They were to protect the property of foreign citizens and adjacent non-Jewish buildings. Firefighters, in turn, received contradictory instructions, not to extinguish burning synagogues, but to intervene if the fire threatened neighboring buildings. In several cities, firefighters stationed themselves around burning synagogues with hoses directed only at adjacent buildings, watching the interiors burn without moving a muscle to put out the fire. The final numbers of the pogrom were recorded with bureaucratic precision by the Nazi authorities themselves. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed or looted across Germany, Austria, and the newly annexed Sudetenland. Between 1,400 and 1,600 synagogues were set on fire, of which more than 1,000 were completely destroyed. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated in dozens of communities. The official number of deaths, recognized by the SS in their own internal report, was 91, although later investigations, including those by historian Alan Steinweiss in his study Kristallnacht 1938, raised this figure significantly, including suicides occurring in the days immediately afterward as a direct consequence of the pogrom. 30,000 men were arrested that night and in the following days. Not for committing any crime, they were arrested for being Jewish. Most were sent by freight trains to the concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. More than 10,000 detainees arrived in Dachau within a week, tripling the camp's capacity. The conditions upon arrival were designed to humiliate. Prisoners were forced to run between two rows of guards who beat them with batons as they arrived. Several died in the first days. Most were released in the following weeks, but only after signing documents committing to emigrate from Germany and transfer their properties before departure. The meeting on November 12, 1938, at the Reich Ministry of Air, presided over by Hermann Göring and attended by representatives of the Gestapo, the Ministry of Economics, the Ministry of Finance, and several German insurance companies, is one of the most revealing documents about the functioning of the Nazi state. The transcript was recovered from the Nuremberg archives and constitutes Exhibit PS-1816 in the collection of evidence for the trials. At the start of the meeting, Göring expressed irritation. The destruction of property had been economically counterproductive. The broken storefronts were mostly imported glass from Belgium, and replacing them would cost foreign currency that Germany could not afford to spend. German insurers were technically supposed to compensate the owners of the destroyed businesses, even if many of those owners were Jewish. The solution adopted was multifaceted. The state confiscated insurance payments owed to Jewish owners. A collective fine of 1 billion marks was imposed on the German Jewish community as atonement for their hostile crimes, and legislation for mandatory Aryanization was accelerated to transfer all remaining Jewish businesses to Aryan owners before January 1, 1939. At the same meeting, Reinhard Heydrich, head of the SS Security Service, presented statistics on Jewish emigration and proposed measures to accelerate it. He noted that since 1933, about 50,000 Jews had emigrated from Germany each year, but the pace was insufficient. Since August 1938, Heydrich had been overseeing the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, Central Office for Jewish Emigration, in Vienna, created under the operational direction of Adolf Eichmann after Austria's annexation in March of that year. The Vienna system had proven more efficient than the German one. It concentrated all the bureaucratic steps necessary for a Jew to obtain an emigration permit in one place, forcing them to liquidate their assets, pay fees, and hand over their properties before receiving the exit document. In Eichmann's own words at his trial in Jerusalem, it was an assembly line of forced emigration. Between March and November 1938, about 50,000 Jews had left Austria under this system. Heydrich proposed extending it to the Reich. Göring approved. It was at this November 12th meeting that Göring made the statement recorded in the minutes. He said he would have preferred to have killed 200 Jews rather than destroy property. The remark reveals a cold, utilitarian logic. Property destruction was economically inefficient, but the physical elimination of people from Göring's perspective was a legitimate goal, just poorly executed in terms of method. It was 1938. 3 years remained until Wannsee. What Kristallnacht communicated to the outside world was equally significant. The embassies of the United States, Great Britain and France in Berlin sent detailed reports to their capitals. U.S. Ambassador Hugh Wilson was called to Washington for consultations. The first time since World War I that the United States had withdrawn its ambassador from Germany and did not return. But no Western power imposed economic sanctions or took concrete measures. The Evian Conference, held in July 1938 to discuss the reception of Jewish refugees, had ended with 32 countries refusing to increase their immigration quotas. International indifference sent its own message to the Nazi regime about the cost of intensifying persecution. Propaganda and indoctrination: how daily hatred was manufactured. The first radio speech Adolf Hitler delivered was broadcast on February 1, 1933, 2 days after his appointment as Chancellor. Millions of Germans listened live. In 1933, there were approximately 4 million radio receivers in Germany. By 1939, that number had risen to 16 million, making Germany the country with the highest density of radio receivers per capita in the world. This was no accident. The Nazi regime produced and distributed the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, a low-cost radio designed specifically so that working-class and peasant households could afford it. The price was set at 76 marks, equivalent to roughly 2 weeks' wages for an industrial worker. The Volksempfänger had a deliberately limited technical range. Its frequency coverage was sufficient to receive German stations, but inadequate for tuning into foreign broadcasts. It was a one-way receiving device designed for a single purpose: Goebbels understood from day one that radio was qualitatively different from the press. The press required literacy, sustained attention, and active reading effort. Radio reached people while they were doing something else, eating, working, resting. It was ubiquitous and passive. Public loudspeakers, the Gemeinschaftsempfänger, were installed in bars, factories, and markets, broadcasting Hitler's speeches and party bulletins. When Hitler spoke, the streets emptied as people crowded around the speakers. The Führer's voice was everywhere. The content of these broadcasts followed a structure designed by the propaganda ministry itself. News broadcasts did not distinguish between news and propaganda. Bulletins included economic statistics always presented in terms of national recovery, accounts of crimes committed by carefully selected Jews, and announcements of government measures against the Jewish threat presented as natural responses to provocations. Language was subject to constant analysis. Victor Klemperer, who listened to the broadcasts from his Dresden apartment while desperately taking notes for his linguistic study, documented how Nazism transformed everyday German. Words like fanatisch, fanatical, acquired positive connotations. Volk, people, gained a racial charge it previously lacked. The word Jude, Jew, was emptied of human content and filled with threatening meaning. This linguistic engineering was not spontaneous. It was the result of directives from the propaganda ministry distributed weekly to all media directors in the country, instructing which words to use, which expressions to avoid, and which framing to apply to each news item. Film was the second instrument. The Reichsfilmkammer, the Reich Film Chamber, under the supervision of the propaganda ministry, controlled the production, distribution, and exhibition of all films in Germany from September 1933. Jews were immediately excluded from the film industry. Jewish actors, directors, screenwriters, producers, and distributors lost their licenses. Many emigrated to Hollywood, where their presence paradoxically contributed to the flourishing of American cinema in the 1930s and 1940s. Those who remained were erased from the credits of their own films. Fritz Lang, director of Metropolis and M, whose mother was Jewish, was summoned by Goebbels in 1933 to offer him the direction of Reich cinematography. Lang took the train to Paris that same afternoon. The most influential anti-Semitic films were not the most explicitly propagandistic, but those that combined the message with popular entertainment. Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, premiered in November 1940, directed by Fritz Hippler under Goebbels' direct instructions. The film interspersed footage of Polish ghettos filmed during the occupation of Poland with sequences of rats in a sewer, establishing a visual equivalence explicitly. A solemn-voiced narrator explained the racial characteristics of Jews, their methods of infiltrating Aryan societies, and their responsibility for communism and global capitalism. The film was shown in cinemas throughout occupied Germany, but attendance was lower than expected. Reports from the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, recorded that some of the audience left the theatre during the harshest sequences, not due to ideological rejection but because of physical revulsion at the images. Goebbels noted in his diary that the film was too brutal for ordinary public taste and produced the opposite effect on less predisposed viewers. The travelling exhibition Der ewige Jude, inaugurated in Munich in November 1937 and which toured 18 German cities before moving to Vienna after the annexation of Austria in 1938, was far more successful. It was visited by more than 412,000 people in Munich alone during its first weeks. The exhibition design was an exercise in the architecture of perception. The visitor advanced through a series of rooms, carefully calculated in size and light to first produce claustrophobia and then contrast. The first rooms displayed images of Eastern European Jews presented as representative of the entire global Jewish community. Men with dark coats, ghetto streets, markets in Yiddish. The following rooms established a supposed connection between these images and Bolshevism, the Jewish press, and international finance. The final room showed images of renewed Nazi Germany, highways, factories, blonde families in gardens. The contrast was the argument. School textbooks were the most systematic and long-term instrument of indoctrination. The National Sozialistischer Lehrerbund, the National Socialist Teachers League, which by 1937 included over 97% of German teachers, distributed curricular directives in all subjects. In biology, the concept of racial hygiene, Rassenhygiene, became mandatory content from the first year of secondary school. Biology textbooks included comparative skull tables, diagrams of racial physical characteristics, and explanations of the supposed genetic inheritance of moral behaviors. Students had to memorize anatomical differences between racial types and learn to visually identify them. In mathematics, exercises included calculations of the economic cost of maintaining the mentally ill, disabled people, and inferior races in society. A 1935 mathematics textbook, Rechnendes Volk, a calculating people, included exercises such as, a mentally ill person costs the state 4 marks per day. Calculate how much money the state would save in 10 years if 300,000 mentally ill people were eliminated. Anti-Semitic indoctrination and eugenic indoctrination were 2 sides of the same program, to define who deserved to belong to the national community and who was a dispensable burden. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls not only indoctrinated but also monitored. Young people were encouraged to report critical comments from their parents, neighbors who tuned into foreign stations, and teachers who expressed doubts about racial doctrine. There were documented cases of children reporting parents, recorded in Gestapo files. Historian Robert Gellertelly, in his study Backing Hitler, 2001, analyzed Gestapo files from Würzburg and concluded that the vast majority of Gestapo investigations were not initiated by the police themselves, but by reports from ordinary citizens, neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. The Nazi surveillance state did not need a massive number of agents because it relied on a network of voluntary informants created by ideology. Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer deserves a more detailed analysis because its operation reveals something that even the most sophisticated propaganda could not achieve: penetration into social strata most resistant to theoretical arguments. The newspaper did not argue, it accused. Each issue contained at least one story of an alleged crime committed by a Jew, preferably sexual in nature, preferably with female or child victims. The accusations did not need to be verifiable. The narrative structure of the medieval blood libel, reproduced with modern variations by the newspaper, operated on the premise that the accusation itself was sufficient proof. Regular readers of Der Stürmer were not primarily intellectuals or party activists. They were shopkeepers, artisans, farmers, and industrial workers with little formal education. The letters to the editor section was constantly fed with reports from readers about Jewish behaviors in their communities, creating a sense of collective participation in surveillance. The public display cases of Der Stürmer, the Stürmerkästen, installed in high pedestrian traffic areas, were instruments of normalization. Seeing the newspaper displayed in the village square next to the fruit kiosk and in front of the church incorporated anti-Semitism into everyday life. It did not need to be read, it just had to be there for no one to remove it, for the mayor not to protest, for the priest to remain silent. The silence of institutions was as educational as the content of the newspaper. Exported hatred, anti-Semitism beyond Germany. When German troops crossed the Austrian border on March 12, 1938, in the operation known as the Anschluss, annexation, the reception in Vienna was not that of a people forcibly subdued. Photographs and newsreels from that day show crowds in the Heldenplatz cheering Hitler from balconies, flowers thrown onto German military vehicles, and scenes that Hitler himself described as the most moving of his life. Austria was not only the first annexed territory, it was the first laboratory outside Germany for the accelerated implementation of anti-Semitic policy. And what happened in Vienna in the following days surprised even the Nazi officials because of its spontaneous intensity. At the time of the Anschluss, approximately 185,000 Jews lived in Vienna, the largest concentration of German-speaking Jews in Europe. Within 48 hours of the German troops' entry, groups of Austrian citizens, without formal instructions from the party apparatus, began organizing what were called Reibpartien, scrubbing parties. Jews identified by their neighbors were taken out of their homes, given brushes and buckets of soapy water, and forced to clean streets and walls on their knees where, in the previous weeks, anti-Nazi slogans had been painted. The street cleanings were observed and in many cases photographed by passers-by who laughed. The historian Götz Ali, in his study Hitler's Beneficiaries, 2005, documented that the Aryanization of Jewish property in Austria was considerably faster and more brutal than in the German Reich, partly because the Nazi bureaucracy took weeks to establish itself, and in that vacuum local initiatives acted without the relative restraint imposed by formal legality in Germany. What the Anschluss immediately revealed was that Austria had its own fully developed institutional anti-Semitism existing prior to any German influence. The Heimwehr, the Austrian Home Guard, a far-right paramilitary movement, the Landbund and the Christian Social Party of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who had been assassinated by the Nazis in 1934, had practiced anti-Semitism rooted in Catholicism and corporatism throughout the Austrian Republic. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian politician who opened the door to annexation and was appointed governor of the Ostmark, Austria's new name within the Reich, did not need instructions from Berlin on how to treat the Jews. He knew exactly what was expected of him and executed it with local efficiency. In Poland, the pre-existing situation was complex. Approximately 3.3 million Polish Jews constituted 10% of the country's total population and formed the largest Jewish community in Europe. Tensions between the Jewish and non-Jewish population had deep roots and had experienced recurring episodes of violence. In the 1930s, the Endekia movement, national democracy, anti-Semitic and nationalist in orientation, had significant parliamentary representation and advocated for the emigration of Polish Jews to Madagascar or Palestine. Several Polish parties and student organizations had implemented the ghetto benches system at universities, segregated rows for Jewish students in classrooms. The University of Warsaw, Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and other Polish academic institutions applied informal quotas that reduced access for Jewish students. In 1937, the Polish government under Józef Beck formally proposed to the League of Nations a plan for the mass emigration of Polish Jews, even contacting the British Mandate authorities in Palestine to assess absorption capacity. The plan never materialized, but its existence reveals that institutional anti-Semitism in Poland was not a German import. However, the German occupation of Poland from September 1939 transformed these pre-existing tensions into something qualitatively different. The ghettos established by German authorities in Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin, Lwów, and dozens of other Polish cities initially functioned as instruments of control and economic exploitation. The Jewish population was concentrated in urban sectors enclosed by walls or fences, forced to surrender their property, subjected to forced labor, and provided with deliberately insufficient food rations. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in November 1940, concentrated over 400,000 people in an area of 3.4 square kilometers. The question of Polish collaboration with Nazi persecution is one of the most delicate and politically charged debates in Holocaust historiography. Jan Grabowski, a Polish-Canadian historian, documented in Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-occupied Poland, 2013, hundreds of cases in which Polish citizens denounced Jewish neighbors to the German authorities, sometimes for money. In some regions, the official reward was 0.5 kilogram of sugar or a liter of vodka per denunciation, and sometimes for personal or ideological reasons. The Szmalkownicy, blackmailers, were Poles who extorted hidden Jews by threatening to report them to the Gestapo. The phenomenon was widespread enough that the Polish government in exile formally condemned it in 1943 and introduced the death penalty that same year for informers under the authority of the Polish underground state. That such a law was necessary indicates the scale of the problem, yet historiography also emphasizes the context. Collaborating with the Germans in handing over Jews involved no risk, while hiding a Jew in Poland was punishable by the death of the entire family. Poland was the only occupied European country where hiding a Jew carried such a cost. Nevertheless, thousands did so. Yad Vashem recognizes over 7,000 Polish citizens as righteous among the nations more than any other country. In the Baltic countries, the speed and brutality of the pogroms following the arrival of German troops in June 1941 indicated the depth of local anti-Semitism. In Kaunas, Lithuania, on June 25 to 26, 1941, barely 4 days after the start of Operation Barbarossa, Groups of Lithuanian civilians known as the Klaimatis partisans, named after their leader Algirdas Klaimaitis, carried out a series of massacres in the Lietuvos garage and in several neighborhoods of the city. More than 3,800 Jews were killed in 2 days. The report of Einsatzgruppe A noted with satisfaction that the pogroms had been organized on local initiative before the German machinery was fully established. In Latvia, the Araj Commando, a Latvian auxiliary unit led by Victor Araj, actively participated in the Rumbula forest massacres in November and December 1941, executing tens of thousands of Latvian Jews alongside the German Einsatzgruppen. Araj was sentenced to life imprisonment in West Germany in 1979 and died in prison in 1988. In Ukraine, the situation had an additional layer of historical complexity. The Ukrainian nationalist movement, led by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and its more radical faction under Stepan Bandera, saw the German invasion as an opportunity to establish an independent Ukrainian state. The Nachtigall, Nightingale, battalion, a Ukrainian military unit trained by the German military intelligence Abwehr, entered Lwów on June 30, 1941, hours after the Soviet retreat. In the following days, between June 30 and July 2, pogroms occurred in the city in which between 4,000 and 6,000 Jews were killed. Direct responsibility among the different factions, Germans, Ukrainian nationalists, local crowds, remains a subject of historical investigation, but available documents indicate the participation of Ukrainian auxiliary units in the killings. Historian John Paul Himka documented this participation using Ukrainian, Soviet, and German archival sources. In France, the Vichy government under Marshal Philippe Pétain demonstrated its own initiative, which remains a subject of historical and legal debate. The Statut des Juifs of October 3, 1940, was drafted by French jurists without prior German instructions and, in some respects, was more restrictive than the equivalent German legislation. It excluded Jews from public service, the army, education, the press, cinema, and liberal professions. Historian Robert Paxton, in his foundational study, Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order, 1972, demonstrated that Vichy antisemitism was not an external imposition, but an expression of pre-existing French ideological currents made possible by military defeat and the collapse of the Republic. In July 1942, the French police organized and executed the large Rafle du Vélodrome d'Hiver, the roundup of 13,152 Parisian Jews, of whom 4,051 were children, concentrated for days under inhumane conditions in the Vel de Hive indoor stadium before being deported to Auschwitz. The German authorities had initially requested only the detention of adult Jews. It was René Bousquet, Secretary General of the Vichy Police, who proposed including the children to facilitate coherence in family deportations. That decision was French. Bousquet survived the war, was symbolically tried and convicted in 1949, rehabilitated for decades within the circles of the French Socialist Party. He was a personal friend of François Mitterrand, and was finally murdered in 1993 by a mentally disturbed person just as he was about to be tried again for crimes against humanity, depriving France of a trial that would have been its own Nuremberg. In the Netherlands, the Dutch administrative apparatus collaborated in the identification and deportation of Dutch Jews with an efficiency that the Germans themselves praised in their internal reports. Of the approximately 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands in 1940, about 107,000 were deported and murdered, the highest mortality rate in Western Europe, higher than that of France and Belgium. Historians Pim Griffioen and sociologist Ron Zeller explained this difference through structural factors. The Netherlands had an exceptionally detailed administrative registration system that facilitated racial identification, a flat geography without mountainous areas for hiding, and a local administration that continued to function under German instructions without the institutional resistance observed in other countries. The head of the German civil administration in the Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the same Austrian who had opened the door to the Anschluss, found in the Dutch bureaucracy a more efficient instrument than he had anticipated. In Romania, the situation had its own characteristics. The legionary movement, known as the Iron Guard, founded in 1923 by Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, combined Orthodox nationalism with violent mysticism and antisemitism that did not require German models because it had its own roots. In January 1941, during the failed legionary coup against Marshal Ion Antonescu, the legionaries carried out in Bucharest one of the most savage pogroms of the period. Approximately 125 Jews were killed, many of them in the municipal slaughterhouse, where the bodies were hung on butcher hooks and marked with stamps reading, "Fit for consumption." In October 1941, Romanian troops under Antonescu's direct command murdered between 25,000 and 34,000 Jews in Odessa in 4 days, without direct German participation. Antonescu did not wait for instructions from Berlin. He had his own ethnic cleansing agenda in Bessarabia and Transnistria, the territories Romania had lost to the USSR in 1940 and reconquered with the 1941 invasion. In those regions, between 1941 and 1944, Romanian authorities murdered or allowed to die from hunger and cold between 250,000 and 300,000 Jews, a figure that made Romania the second state responsible for the largest number of Jewish deaths after Nazi Germany. In Hungary, Regent Miklos Horthy maintained an ambiguous position that for years protected Hungarian Jews from deportation while simultaneously subjecting them to harsh discriminatory legislation and employing tens of thousands of Jewish men in forced labor battalions on the Eastern Front, where the mortality rate was extremely high due to cold, hunger, and mistreatment. That ambiguity ended on March 19, 1944, with the German occupation of Hungary. In the 12 weeks that followed, between May and July 1944, more than 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in an operation coordinated by Adolf Eichmann that used the Hungarian railway as the main instrument. The director of the Hungarian State Railways, János Böhm, negotiated fares with Eichmann, 4 pfennigs per kilometre per adult passenger, half for children under 10. The trains were third class. Each freight car carried between 70 and 100 people. The speed of these deportations, over 12,000 people daily at the peak, was possible because the local Hungarian bureaucracy actively collaborated in the identification, concentration, and transportation of the deportees. It was precisely in the context of the 1944 Hungarian deportations that one of the most debated episodes in Holocaust history occurred, the so-called Kastner train. Rudolf Kastner, a Zionist leader in Budapest, negotiated directly with Eichmann for the release of 1,684 Hungarian Jews, selected partly for their ties to the Zionist community, partly for their economic means, in exchange for money, goods, and the promise not to sabotage the deportations. That train arrived in Switzerland in December 1944. The debate over whether Kastner saved the few he could or collaborated with the Germans to save his own position has divided historians and survivors for decades. Kastner was assassinated in Tel Aviv in 1957. The hatred that knew no limit towards the final solution. By 1939, the Nazi regime had achieved what it had promised in its 1920 program. Jews had been expelled from German economic, political, cultural, and social life. Approximately half of the 500,000 Jews living in Germany in 1933 had emigrated. Many had gone to France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Poland, countries that the war would reach in 1940 and 1941. The war changed the parameters. By invading Poland in September 1939, Germany incorporated about 3 million Polish Jews into its sphere of domination. By invading the USSR in June 1941, it incorporated several million more. The exclusionary and ghetto policies that had worked to manage 500,000 people proved impossible to scale to this dimension. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile extermination units of the SS, followed the German army in its advance through the Soviet Union and began to execute Jewish communities en masse. On September 29th to 30th, 1941, in the Babi Yar ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, under the command of SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, executed 33,771 Jews in 2 days. It was the largest single massacre of World War II in a single place and time. The bodies were thrown into the ravine. The earth moved for days. On January 20th, 1942, in a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 senior officials of the Nazi regime met for just over 90 minutes to coordinate the implementation of what they called the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question. The protocol of that meeting, drafted by Adolf Eichmann, SS Obersturmbannführer and head of Section 4B4 of the Gestapo responsible for Jewish affairs, was discovered in 1947. Its bureaucratic coldness remains one of the most disturbing documents in history. Nothing was invented at Wannsee. Mass killings were already taking place. What was done was to coordinate bureaucracy, distribute responsibilities among ministries, establish that Jews from each occupied country would be transported east. Those incapable of work would be immediately eliminated. Those capable of work would be eliminated after exhaustion through forced labor. The language of the Wannsee Protocol is euphemistic throughout the document. The murders are special treatments, gas chambers are technical facilities, extermination is evacuation to the east. But behind that sterile language, an operation took place that, according to the most accepted historical calculations, killed 6 million Jews between 1941 and 1945, approximately one-third of all Jews in the world at that time.